My name is Olivia Smith. I'm 31. My ex stalked me for 2 years, slashed a stranger's tires, and threatened any man who talked to me, until I found someone stronger, and then everything changed. I was standing on the sidewalk outside my apartment building, keys in my hand, when I noticed the sedan idling across the street. It was parked crooked, half over the curb, engine running. I knew the car before I consciously registered it. Same dent above the back tire, same dark tint on the windows. I didn't turn my head right away. I unlocked the door, stepped inside the lobby, then paused just long enough to look through the glass. He was still there. After 2 years, I could tell when he wanted me to see him. The car hadn't been there 10 minutes earlier. I'd checked before leaving the cafe down the block. He timed it so I'd notice, so I'd understand he was watching again. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket, no number attached, just a message preview. Who was the guy you were laughing with? I didn't answer. I never did anymore. The elevator was slow. I stood with my back to the wall, listening for footsteps, for the sound of a door opening behind me. Nothing happened. That was the point. He didn't need to come closer to make it clear he could. When I reached my floor, I walked past my own apartment and down to the stairwell window at the end of the hall. From there, I could see the street below. The sedan was gone. That didn't mean he'd left. It meant he'd moved. I locked my door, set my bag down, and pulled the blinds just enough to look out without being obvious. A man from the building next door crossed the street, carrying groceries. I didn't recognize him. He nodded at me through the glass, polite, nothing more. I felt my stomach tighten. 10 minutes later, I heard tires screech outside. Not an accident. A sharp, deliberate sound. I didn't go to the window this time. I already knew what I'd see. I sat on the edge of my couch and waited for my phone to light up again. It did. Tell your friend to be careful where he parks. I stayed seated. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I opened my laptop instead and pulled up the notes file I kept hidden behind a generic folder name. Date, time, location, description. My hands were steady when I typed. Before I continue, I want to ask for a small favor. This channel is still growing, and subscribing helps a lot. It's free and your support genuinely makes a difference. Let's continue. I didn't realize yet what that small, quiet habit was going to lead to. I only knew I was done pretending this would resolve itself if I stayed small enough. The next morning, I didn't leave my apartment until the sun was fully up. I stood at the kitchen counter, coffee cooling in my hands, watching the street from the narrow gap in the blinds. Cars passed. A delivery truck stopped and left. Nothing looked out of place. That didn't mean anything. I checked my phone before I left. No new messages. That was usually when he was most active, after a night of silence, when he decided I'd been ignoring him long enough. I took the stairs instead of the elevator and walked the long way around the block before heading toward the train. I kept my pace even. I didn't wear headphones. I didn't look behind me unless there was a reason. At the station, a man in a work jacket asked if the eastbound train was delayed. It was a normal question, the kind people ask strangers every day. I answered him, then stepped back, putting space between us without making it obvious. 2 stops later, my phone vibrated. You don't need to talk to other men to get attention. I didn't reply. I got off 1 stop early and walked the remaining 6 blocks to the studio where I worked. I arrived late. No one asked why. By mid-morning, the building manager forwarded me an email. Someone had complained about a car parked overnight in the loading zone. The description matched his sedan. The manager asked if I knew whose it was. I wrote back that I didn't. At lunch, I ate at my desk. Through the window, I could see the street 2 floors below. Around 1, the sedan drove past slowly, once then again. It didn't stop. That was new. Lately, he'd been careful about staying just long enough to be noticed and not long enough to be reported. That afternoon, I called the non-emergency line and explained that someone was following me and damaging property near my building. The woman on the phone asked if I'd seen him do it. I said no. She asked if he'd threatened me directly. I paused, then said not exactly. She suggested I keep documenting and call back if anything escalated. After work, I went to the grocery store even though I didn't need anything. I stayed inside longer than necessary, walking the same aisles twice. When I finally left, I scanned the parking lot before unlocking my car. A man loading bags into the trunk next to me smiled and stepped back to give me space. I nodded, quick and stiff, and got in. I didn't see the sedan. The relief didn't last. Halfway home, my phone rang, unknown number. I let it ring until it stopped, then it rang again. I didn't answer. When I pulled into my apartment lot, I noticed fresh black marks on the asphalt near my parking space. Rubber. Recent. I parked anyway and went inside without looking around. That night, I added 3 more entries to my notes file. I attached the forwarded email. I took photos of the parking lot from my window. I slept with the lights on. I still told myself, quietly, that if I stayed careful enough, this could be contained. That it would burn itself out if I didn't react. I was wrong. 3 days passed without a message. That was unusual enough that I noticed it immediately. I still checked my phone the same way, screen face down, sound off, notifications filtered, but the silence sat differently. It didn't feel like relief. It felt like someone holding their breath. On the 4th day, my laptop stopped turning on. I tried all the things I knew how to do. Different charger. Hard reset, waiting longer than made sense. Nothing worked. The screen stayed black, and with it, most of my work. I packed it into my bag and left the apartment without overthinking it. Staying inside too long had started to feel worse than being out. The repair shop was wedged between a dry cleaner and a closed nail salon. The sign flickered even though it was broad daylight. Inside, it smelled like dust and warm plastic. A man stood behind the counter, tall enough that I had to tilt my head to meet his eyes. He didn't rush me. He listened while I explained what the laptop had been doing, nodding once, then twice. When he took it from me, his hands were careful in a way I noticed immediately. "You can sit," he said, gesturing to a chair. "Might take a minute." I waited. He worked quietly, tools laid out with deliberate precision. After a while, the screen lit up. He turned it toward me so I could see. "That should hold," he said. "Battery connection was loose." I asked what I owed him. He shook his head. 5 minutes isn't billable." I thanked him and slid the laptop back into my bag. As I opened the door, something in my chest tightened, sharp and familiar. I stopped and looked through the front window. Across the street, the sedan was parked at an angle I hadn't seen before, close enough that there was no doubt. I stepped outside anyway. The man from the shop followed a moment later to lock up for lunch. He stood beside me, towering without trying to. I could feel his presence, solid and unhurried. For the first time in a long while, I didn't immediately calculate an escape route. The sedan didn't move. Neither did I. After a few seconds, I walked away. I didn't look back. I waited for my phone to buzz. It didn't. That night, I sat on my bed with my laptop open and added a new line to my notes file. Different location, different time, same car. I also added something else beneath it. Not an explanation, just a name, the repair shop, the address. I didn't know why I did that. I only knew that something had shifted slightly and that whatever came next wouldn't follow the same pattern. I didn't start documenting because I wanted proof. I started because I needed order. After the breakup, he showed up at my building the same night. I hadn't blocked his number yet. I was still telling myself we could be civil if I stayed calm. When he started knocking, it was controlled at first. Polite, even. When I didn't answer, the sound changed. He called my name like I'd misplaced something of his. A neighbor opened her door. He smiled at her and said there must have been a misunderstanding. By the time the police arrived, he was already gone. The report said domestic disagreement. No follow-up. That set the tone. After that, he never stayed long. He learned quickly. He'd park where cameras didn't quite reach. He'd wait until I was with other people before sending messages. He didn't yell anymore. He asked questions. Who was I meeting? Why did I need to dress like that? Why was I smiling at strangers? Once, at a coffee shop near my office, a man behind the counter asked if I wanted my usual. It was a harmless thing. Later that afternoon, I got a photo of a car in the alley behind the cafe. 2 tires flattened. No words attached. I went to the police station with that message pulled up on my phone. The officer looked at it for a long moment, then asked if I'd seen who did it. I said no. He suggested I stop engaging and change my routines. He said some people have trouble letting go. At the gym, a man asked if I was done with a machine. It was crowded. I said yes and stepped aside. The next day, management called to tell me someone had caused a scene in the weight room, shouting about disrespect. The description matched him. They banned him from the building. He texted me that night, angry but careful, telling me I'd embarrassed him. I stopped going. Friends told me to move. My sister offered her couch in another city. I said no, not because I was brave, because leaving felt like confirming that this was his territory now, and I wasn't ready to give him that. So I adjusted, I walked less, I spoke less. I shrank my world to what felt manageable. The notes file grew slowly. Dates, screenshots, locations, things that didn't mean much on their own but formed a pattern when placed side by side. I didn't think of it as building a case. I thought of it as leaving a trail for myself in case I ever started to doubt what I was seeing. By the time the sedan appeared across from the repair shop, that file was already thick. I just hadn't known yet what would finally tip the balance. Over time, the days began to resemble each other too closely. I stopped making plans that required explanations. I shopped late or early, never in between. I learned which streets had better lighting and which intersections he liked to linger near. When friends invited me out, I said I was tired. Eventually, they stopped asking. At home, I kept the television low and the lights dim. I charged my phone in the kitchen so I wouldn't wake up to it buzzing beside my head. If I heard a car slow outside, I froze until it passed. I started sleeping in the clothes I'd wear the next morning, just in case I needed to leave quickly. I did try to make it official. I took my notes file, printed screenshots, and sat in a waiting room with a plastic chair that stuck to the back of my legs. When I finally spoke to someone about a restraining order, they asked for dates, witnesses, direct threats. I had pieces, not the kind of narrative they needed. He always had a reason for being where he was. A gym membership, a public street, a coincidence. They told me to keep documenting. I went back to my apartment and stared at the walls for a long time after that. I wasn't crying. I was recalibrating. The sedan came and went. Sometimes weeks passed without it. Other times, it appeared twice in one day. Once, it followed me for 3 blocks before turning away, like it had accomplished something just by being seen. I avoided farmers' markets, street fairs, anywhere people lingered. I learned to keep my eyes down, my expressions neutral. If someone spoke to me, I answered briefly and moved on. I hated how natural that became. There were nights I thought about leaving, about packing a bag and disappearing into a different routine, a different version of myself. Each time, I imagined him finding out anyway, showing up there too, turning that place into another thing I'd have to give up. So I stayed. I told myself this was temporary, that I could manage it if I stayed alert enough, careful enough, that it was better to live small in a familiar place than start over somewhere he could still reach. By the time my laptop died and I walked into that repair shop, I hadn't had a full, unguarded conversation with a stranger in over a year. I didn't think of myself as trapped then. I thought I was being practical. Looking back, the difference is thinner than I realized. I went back to the repair shop 2 days later because the charging port was still loose. It wasn't urgent. I could have waited. But the idea of carrying the laptop across town to another place felt heavier than walking the same short block again. He recognized me as soon as I walked in, not in a way that made me feel noticed, just remembered. He took the laptop, checked the port, tightened something I couldn't see. "That should stop it from slipping," he said. I asked if I owed him this time. He named a number so low I almost laughed, then shrugged when I hesitated. I paid it and thanked him. That could have been the end of it. As I stepped outside, he locked up behind me again. He nodded toward the sky, where the heat had started to settle in. "You okay walking?" he asked casually, not protective, not assuming. I said yes. Halfway down the block, my phone buzzed. I didn't look at it, I already knew. The sedan was parked at the far end of the street, angled toward the curb. I felt my pace slow without meaning to. The man from the shop didn't comment. He just kept walking at the same steady speed beside me. When we reached the corner, he stopped and checked his watch. "I've got lunch," he said. "You're headed that way." I nodded. We crossed together. The sedan stayed where it was. No engine noise, no movement. At the next block, he peeled off toward a food truck, lifted a hand in a brief goodbye, and went on with his day. I stood there for a second longer than necessary, then I walked home. That night I waited for the messages. None came. The next 3 days were quiet, too quiet to feel accidental. I kept my routines tight and my expectations low. On Saturday morning, I went to the farmer's market for the first time in over a year. I told myself it was early enough to be safe. I stayed near the edges, bought tomatoes I didn't need, and prepared to leave after 10 minutes. I heard my name. He was standing near a breakfast stand, holding 2 paper-wrapped burritos. He smiled, easy and unhurried, like this wasn't an interruption. "Didn't want to startle you," he said, "but I thought you might want one." I hesitated, then accepted it. We leaned against a low concrete wall and ate. He told me a little about the shop. I told him what I did for work, kept it vague. 2 hours passed without me checking the street once. When he asked for my number, I surprised myself by giving it to him. That night, I stared at my phone for a long time before sending a message. I told him briefly why my life had gotten small. I didn't soften it, but I didn't dramatize it either. His reply came a few minutes later. He said he wasn't afraid of my past. He said he'd like to take me to dinner if I was willing. I set the phone down and sat very still. Outside, the street stayed quiet. We chose a small restaurant on a side street that stayed busy without being loud. I arrived early and asked for a table near the window, not so I could see him coming, so I could see the street. He showed up exactly on time. He didn't comment on where I sat or why I kept my phone face down. He ordered after I didn't rush the conversation, didn't fill the quiet when it settled between us. That alone felt unfamiliar. Halfway through the meal, a man brushed past our table on his way to the restroom. I felt my shoulders tense before I could stop it. The man from the shop, his name was Noah, noticed, but he didn't ask what was wrong. He shifted his chair slightly, blocking the aisle without making a point of it, and kept talking about the repair work he'd been buried under that week. When we left, I waited for the night to change shape, for the sedan to appear, for my phone to vibrate. Nothing happened. We walked 2 blocks together before parting ways. He didn't insist on seeing me to my door. He didn't ask where I lived. He hugged me briefly, like it was something we both had the right to end. That night, I slept without the lights on for the first time in months. Over the next week, we saw each other in ordinary ways. Coffee before work, a walk through a park in the middle of the afternoon. I told him where I didn't like to go and when I preferred to be home. He accepted it without negotiating. One evening, sitting on opposite ends of my couch, he told me what he did outside the shop. Not the repairs, the other work. He trained, competed, fought professionally. I watched his face as he said it. There was no pride in it, no edge, just fact. I didn't say much. I didn't need to. He explained that fighting had taught him restraint more than aggression. That knowing exactly what he could do meant he didn't feel the need to prove it. I believed him, not because of his size, but because of how little he used it. 3 weeks in, I went with a friend to watch one of his fights. I sat in the crowd with my hands folded tight in my lap, trying to focus on the ring and not the exits. He won quickly, too quickly for me to understand what I'd just seen. Afterward, he introduced me to the people around him as his girlfriend. He didn't look at me to check if that was okay. He said it like it was already true and trusted me to correct him if it was. I didn't. Driving home that night, I realized something else had changed. I hadn't checked my phone once during the match, not for messages, not for updates, not for reassurance. For the first time in a long while, the space around me felt uninterrupted. I kept waiting for the pattern to reassert itself. Every time Noah and I made plans, I left extra time afterward, the way I always had. I watched the street before I got into my car. I checked reflections in store windows. I told myself this wasn't fear, it was habit. Our first few dinners passed without incident. No messages, no car idling nearby. The quiet felt almost suspicious. I didn't tell Noah every time my phone buzzed with an unknown number, but I did tell him when the silence started to feel deliberate. He listened without interrupting, his hands resting flat on the table, like he wasn't preparing for anything, just taking it in. One night, walking back from a movie, I stopped short on the sidewalk. Across the street, the sedan rolled past slowly. Not stopping, not turning, just passing like a reminder. My chest tightened. I waited for Noah to react. He didn't turn his head. He didn't square his shoulders or speed up. He kept walking at the same pace, close enough that I could feel the heat from his arm through my jacket. "Do you want to head home?" he asked, "or grab tea?" I chose tea, not because I wasn't afraid, but because I didn't want my answer to be decided for me. Nothing happened after that. No texts, no photos, no threats dressed up as concern. Days passed, then a week. At the next fight, Noah won again. Afterward, one of his teammates clapped him on the shoulder and asked how his luck had been lately. Noah glanced at me and smiled. Later that night, sitting on the edge of his bed, he told me something he hadn't mentioned before. 2 weeks earlier, a man had come into the shop while I was at work. Asked questions that didn't quite line up. Wanted to know if Noah was getting involved with someone who caused problems. Noah hadn't told me because the conversation had ended quickly. Because the man had left when Noah made it clear the questions weren't welcome. He won't be back, Noah said, not as a challenge, as a conclusion. I didn't ask what had been said. I didn't need details to understand the shift. For the first time, the confrontation hadn't reached me directly. It had stopped somewhere else. That night, I went home and slept deeply, the kind that leaves you disoriented in the morning. When I checked my phone, there were no missed calls, no new messages. The street outside, my apartment, was empty. I wrote one short line in my notes file before closing it. No contact, 2 weeks. I didn't know yet how long it would last. I only knew the pressure had eased and that whatever hold he'd relied on before was slipping. It came out in pieces, the way most careful truths do. We were sitting on his couch one evening, shoes kicked off, a fight replaying quietly on the television without sound. I was half listening, half watching the street through the window when Noah reached for the remote and turned it off. "There's something I should probably tell you," he said. He didn't wait for my reaction. He didn't frame it like a confession. He spoke the same way he did when explaining a repair, direct, economical. The man who'd come into the shop hadn't just asked questions. He stayed too long. He tried to position himself behind the counter, like proximity itself was leverage. He mentioned my name once, casually, to see what would happen. Noah had stepped back instead of forward. He told him the shop was monitored, that he trained fighters for a living, that he didn't threaten people, but he followed through when lines were crossed. "And then," I asked. "And then he left," Noah said. "He hasn't been back." I noticed what he didn't say. No raised voices, no posturing, no retaliation afterward. The confrontation had been contained, finished before it could spill outward. I felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't realized was still tight. 4 months passed. The notes file stayed closed. The sedan never reappeared. Unknown numbers stopped calling. The quiet this time didn't feel like someone holding their breath. It felt like space. We moved in together slowly, the way you ease into cold water. First a toothbrush, then a drawer. Eventually a lease with a yard I didn't know what to do with yet. Noah asked me where I felt safest and worked around that, not the other way around. Our first argument was about something small, his habit of leaving gear in the hallway, my need for clear exits. He listened. He apologized. He changed it the next day without reminding me he'd done so. That was new. One afternoon, at a grocery store I hadn't been to in years, I saw him at the end of an aisle. Older somehow. Smaller. He glanced at me, recognized me, and turned his cart the other way without a word. I stood there longer than necessary, waiting for the familiar rush of fear. It didn't come. When I told Noah later, he didn't smile or ask questions. He just nodded once, like something had finally aligned. "He doesn't get to make your world smaller anymore," he said. "That's all." That night, I slept with the windows open. The months after that settled into a rhythm I hadn't known I could have. I went to the farmer's market again, later in the morning this time, without glancing over my shoulder. I let strangers smile at me and returned it. I bought fresh bread I didn't need, lingered over the stand with peppers I didn't usually touch, and felt the sun warm my shoulders without planning an escape. Noah came with me a few times, not to shield me, not to manage me, just to walk beside me. He carried his own bag of groceries, joked with the vendors, and sometimes paused to explain a punch combination from a fight he'd watched the night before. I listened because I wanted to, not because I was calculating danger. One evening, after a particularly busy day at work, I had a panic reaction at a small restaurant. A friend's partner started telling a story about someone like my ex, and my chest tightened, hands trembling slightly. Noah leaned over, guided me quietly to the car, never questioning me, never rushing me. When I was breathing steadily again, he said simply, "We'll go home, we're okay." That was enough. I started seeing Dr. Lisa Chen again. Her office smelled faintly of tea and old books. We worked slowly. She helped me untangle fear from caution, guilt from habit. She never asked me to forget what had happened, only to see it as pieces I didn't have to carry anymore. Even the grocery store, the same one where my ex had last lingered, became a neutral place. I walked down the aisles, picked up eggs, glanced at someone in the produce section, smiled without calculating threat. And then came the message from Amber. She was dating him now, or trying to, and she suspected the patterns I had lived through. I met her. I told her the whole story, the surveillance, the intimidation, the small terror made routine. She listened, pale and quiet. Later, she called me, scared. He had appeared outside her apartment. Noah and I drove straight there. He confronted my ex with calm precision. He didn't yell or rage. He told him the consequences of any further interference, legal, social, and professional. My ex left. He didn't come back. I realized then that I had been living half a life, small and cautious, for 2 years. And that half had ended not with a fight or an outburst, but with steady boundaries, visible and enforced. We returned to the farmer's market the next morning. The same stands, the same smell of breakfast burritos and fresh bread. Noah told me he was competing again soon, but he also said something quieter, that meeting me had changed his life. I didn't need to respond, only to hear it. I walked away from the stand with a sense of space I hadn't felt in years, the kind where you don't count the exits or check over your shoulder. Noah encouraged me to return to Dr. Chen, even though I had resisted at first. It had been easier to push through each day with caution than to sit in a room with someone asking me to name what I had lived through. But one rainy afternoon, I found myself in her office again, letting the window fog up with my breath as I talked. We went slowly. I described the constant checking, the corners of my apartment I avoided, the small, sharp panic that still lingered at strangers' voices. She didn't flinch. She didn't gasp. She only helped me map out what was fear, what was habit, and what was real threat. We practiced being in public, imagining scenarios where I could respond without freezing, where I could exist without shrinking. At first, it was exhausting. My body wanted to curl, to brace. But week by week, those exercises, the small walks, the brief interactions with strangers, even the grocery store aisle I had avoided, felt less like survival drills and more like ordinary steps. One evening, after a session, I found myself smiling at a man holding a loaf of bread across the store aisle. No tension, no calculation, only the reflection of normal human interaction. I realized I hadn't done that in years.